All right, just a couple of things. Mr. Grout, just as follow-up from when you testified on Monday, you'd indicated in your testimony that when the second draft of the IFMP was prepared, you weren't sure if it got posted on the internet or not. Have you had a chance to look into that?
Oh, right. Yes, I did check on that. We do post the second draft of the IFMP on our consultation secretariat.
Thanks. Mr. Rosenberger, when we broke on Monday, we were discussing the roles of Canada and the Fraser River panel once the season begins. And just to recap, can you outline what the decisions are that are made by the, just at an overview level, what the decisions are that are made by the Fraser River panel in season?
The panel is responsible for any run size, adopting any run size changes, management adjustment changes, the harvesting in Canada on commercial fisheries within panel waters, and the fisheries in the U.S. side of in panel waters.
Okay. And what are the decisions that Department of Fisheries and Oceans is responsible for in season?
Canada would be making changes to the, or adopting and managing the fisheries, commercial fisheries outside of panel waters and all recreational and First Nations fisheries.
You've already described how often the Fraser River panel and the technical committee meet in season, and when Mr. Lapointe was here, we reviewed examples of the data presented by the PSC staff to the panel in season. And when we were reviewing that data with Mr. Lapointe, we referred to a document known as the Record of Management Strategies. We looked at the 2009 document, and that's now Exhibit 330, and I think it's in your second volume of materials. Got that?
Yeah,
okay.
25.
So I don't know if this is more appropriate for Mr. Grout or for Mr. Rosenberger, but what is that document and who prepares it?
Well, it's a document prepared by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, so it's an internal prepared document. And what it does is summarizes all of the information for the season of a management. So we put in there all of our preseason information. The key points to it are the in-season decisions that we make. So what information do we have on each given decision point day, and so all the technical information, the debate that might have gone on, the variety of views, and at times are recorded, and so the decisions that we made, and then subsequently fisheries that are planned out of that. So it's a document that chronicles the an entire year for the Fraser River fishery.
And once it's put together, how is it used? Why do you do it?
Well, it's an excellent reference document. So fish managers, the resource managers, biologists, people like myself will take this document with them to planning sessions. So you'll take a look and they'll have a good sense about what are your issues in a given year, so that if you need to make changes or corrections or you want to adapt for future years, it's part of what we call our adaptive management process, which is links into things like wild salmon policy. And in particular, when you get out and you start looking back on cycle years, so in the case of the 09 year, when somebody's in 2013 and thinking, what are we doing, why did we do what we're doing, how does this compare, it'll be an excellent reference material for them.
Is it a public document?
I believe it is, yes. It's posted in the department.
And it contains, amongst a lot of other materials, it also contains all the materials that were prepared by the Salmon Commission for the technical committee and the Fraser River panel meetings.
Yeah, they're fairly large, as you can see in this one, and it has all the materials from each meeting, in which cases, as we talked about earlier, it's usually twice a week, and pre-season planning documents, post-season review, meeting information, things like that.
Okay. So I want to ask you some questions about the in-season process, and I'm going to ask these questions from your perspective as the chair of the Canadian caucus on the Fraser River panel. We did spend quite a bit of time with Mr. Lapointe going through all the technical information, so I'm not necessarily going to take you back through all of that. As I understand it, the technical committee reviews the initial technical data provided by the Salmon Commission staff. Is that fair?
In most cases, that's the first point of review.
Okay, and then following that technical committee meeting, is there a meeting of the Canadian caucus?
In most cases, yes.
Okay. And what happens in those caucus meetings?
We'll get an update from the tech chair in most cases, and review the information, usually highlighted to issues of change. So if there's a potential run size change, management adjustment change, timing, whatever it might be that might affect decisions that we want to make, either in adopting a change or in potential impacts towards fisheries. So we have that debate around the technical information, then we tend to focus on our opportunities for fisheries, and each of the groups, between the managers and the representatives of the different groups, we try to formulate what our options might be in our fisheries and what we might be looking to recommend when we get into the bilateral panel meeting.
Are any PSC staff at that meeting?
No.
Who is at that meeting?
The Canadian caucus, so it's Fraser panel members, Canadian side, the tech committee members, and not necessarily all of them, and either in person or on phone, we tend to have a number of the Fraser River Integrated Management Team people, so that's departmental managers.
Fishing, you describe them as opportunities, but fishing plans or opportunities are discussed. How are those fishing options developed? What's the process?
Well, we'd look at what the total allowable catch to Canada would be. We'd start usually with what our First Nations fisheries are, so how many fish we need to pass either into past mission as part of the gross escapement, plans for fisheries in Lower River, which is around that area, or that looking into the marine waters. So when we understand what that might mean to each of the stock groupings and their potential fisheries, is there TAC left over, total allowable catch left over for other users, recreational and commercial, and then if it's apportioned out, so relative amount of fish, and then you get into the planning for what your options might be. If there's lots of fish, then there's more opportunities that you might be considering, more locations. For example, in the seine fishery in the south coast, whether you want to be fishing in Juan de Fuca Straits as well as Johnson Straits, so diversion rates, abundance, off the river. So there's various locations, time, effort, that kind of stuff.
And it's probably an obvious question, but a fishing plan, like when you're talking about these fishing plans or options, it would be something like we want to allow X number of fish to be caught in a quota fishery in a particular area in a particular week, or a particular area fishery will be open for a certain number of hours. Those are what we're talking about when we're talking about plans?
That's correct.
Okay. Are the decision rules that are set out in the IFMP used in this decision making within the Canadian caucus?
That's correct. So our Integrated Fisheries Management Plan has our domestic rules and principles in there. So some of those apply to the international side of things, so our escapement objectives, for example. But Canada also has additional objectives. So we have fishery objectives in the 2010 year around earliest timed early summer stocks. We had additional actions that Canada was taking around cultists, for example, so where we're looking to manage into more than the 4 stock groupings, or have some other domestic objectives that we need to bring into play. So it's always forms part of our Canadian planning.
And in season, can the Canadian caucus recommend plans which are outside the IFMP decision rules?
We discuss, again in 2010, we discussed options when circumstances were substantially different than what was expected in season. In this case, around the late run timing as an aggregate, all of the fish were, but then what that meant to cultists, what were the cultists rebuilding objectives from a process that's described in the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan versus the rules that we had established in the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan to try to meet that objective, and was there opportunities? So we started discussing in there, and then subsequently it was a broader discussion. But so yes, we do look at other we do look at implications out of those rules or principles.
Make fishing plans that varied from the decision rules that were in the original IFMP?
We did, but we just to be clear that those aren't recommendations or decisions that we made in the Fraser caucus side of things. Once that group decided that it was worth exploring further, we needed to go and prepare briefing notes to the minister and Ottawa people to get concurrence that we could make a change to the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan.
Okay, so any change, like you just described, would require an approach to the minister before you could go ahead with a plan
That's correct.
Just like that, okay. And did you consult with different stakeholder groups before making that change to the IFMP in 2010?
Yes, we did, around the cultist decision. Yes, from From the discussion that was raised in caucus, it was decided that it was worth exploring, so the Department of Fisheries and Oceans prepared some information that we were using inside the caucus as well as internally in this region. So in this case, it was myself and Jeff and others briefing up to the Regional Director General, getting concurrence that we would consider this type of an approach. We were briefing to Ottawa at the same time. I took consultations to some of the First Nations in the area most affected, as had been described as the key First Nations from the larger Fraser aggregate of First Nations that they would be the place to consult. So we talked with the Stolo groups and
Suwali.
What is
The other group is Suwali.
Suwali. Thank you.
Whose territory includes Cultus Lake.
Earlier this week when we were meeting with Mr. Lapointe, we talked about the pre-season fishing plans that are developed with by the PSC staff before the season begins. So that he talked about his fishing planning model. Do the results of those pre-season fishing planning models have a role in season when you're developing the fishing plans?
They do. First, I would say that the PSC staff doesn't develop the fishing options. Those are developed by both of the countries, and the model is managed by the PSC, but the options that are presented into there are what Canada brings or the US brings into to populate the model. And then on your question, yes, it does help us to formulate the options that we would be looking at, but the vast majority of fisheries are defined by in-season data, and so they're often different. You know, if the timing is earlier or later, or one stock is more or less abundant than you expect. So it's the in-season data that drives the decisions, but it does help us to get a sense of when we should be doing something if it was as per the conditions that we populated the model with.
I think you already mentioned that you do look at the different decisions that are being contemplated for First Nations FSC fisheries at the time you're within the Canadian caucus. You bring those decision possibilities forward, is that right?
That's correct.
And does the Canadian caucus get its information about FSC fisheries from the integrated management team that's as part of that caucus?
Well, the proposed fisheries around the First Nations are generally brought forward by myself from the information that I have as the chair of the Fraser integrated management team, so that knowledge, so that we cover them all off.
Okay.
If there's specifics about what we might be planning somewhere, then one of the staff members would elaborate more as needed.
Okay, and again, decisions that I will be dealing more with the Fraser River integrated management team in some detail. So this is more just a flagging of points. In the Canadian caucus, do you consider decisions that are being made on commercial openings outside panel waters and also First Nations economic fisheries?
All of the fisheries, answer this maybe in the reverse, but hopefully I get what you want. The First Nations food, social, and salmon fisheries, the department provides essentially information and an update so that people understand what stocks we're harvesting, potential impacts, and so we understand what might be left over for available catch. The commercial fisheries and the licensed areas, the First Nations economic fisheries and the rec fisheries are essentially debated in the room as to how to make them all fit together for essentially optimum performance or meeting the objectives that people bring to the table. But so all other fisheries, whether they're in the panel waters from Canadian side or outside, are discussed. And
do discussions happen between the Canadian and the U.S. chairs outside of the full bilateral panel meetings?
yes.
And why do you have those discussions outside of the bilateral meetings?
To try to get a sense of the scope of the issues that each party might be bringing. So, and whether either party is presumably they're being briefed on the same technical information. So, whether they may or may not be looking to adopt a run size change. The information is provided to us with some uncertainty to it, so the bounds to it. Is it making sense? Do we need to look at other information requests that we might want to have before we make decisions? And then each party is trying to give the other one a heads up as to the fisheries that they're proposing. So you just have a longer chance to think about them and debate them within your caucus before sitting in the panel. And we often break in the panel to go and consider each other's fishery proposals, but it helps to give just more of a opportunity to do that.
currently, the Fraser River panel only makes decisions on fisheries that occur before mission. Is that like marine areas and then in river before mission?
The panel, that's correct, in the panel waters.
Okay. But under the treaty, the panel waters actually extend beyond mission, isn't that right?
That's correct.
So is it just by convention, or maybe by the fact that traditionally commercial harvests haven't been above mission, that the Fraser River panel hasn't made decisions on those fisheries?
That's pretty well the way it's just the evolution is that as the department has been working and creating First Nations economic fisheries above mission, the panel has not taken on the role of adopting or having to authorize those fisheries.
If the commercial fisheries above mission became more significant, do you anticipate there may be a change in the interest of the Fraser River panel to become involved in the management of those fisheries?
But there's a potential for sure. At this point, the U.S. has been strongly supportive of Canada moving more of its fisheries terminally. The less fish that's taken before their fisheries is their interest here. So being more terminally in our harvesting, or a higher proportion of the fish harvested terminally from Canada's allowable catch, at this point they've identified as in their interest, and they support that. So whether they would want to have more of a say in the adopting or authorizing those fisheries, at this point they haven't made any moves that would be in their interest, or that they would want to do that.
Who speaks for Canada? Who's the decision maker for Canada?
The Department of Fisheries and Oceans, so the panel chair.
You.
That's me.
All right, once a decision is made in the Fraser River panel about fishing plans, what's the process for implementing those decisions?
Well, as a panel meeting ends and we've made decisions around specific fisheries, the Fraser River Integrated Management Team members, so the Department of Fisheries and Oceans managers, would need to then either create variation notices or whatever the legal instrument is to authorize a given fishery. So we might have all the details already worked out, and that's easy. Sometimes we hold, again, another Canadian caucus FRIMP meeting to work through some of the details. And for some of the fisheries, the non-panel water fisheries, where it's less specific what will occur, in particular around some of the First Nations fisheries, the managers will then go and have a meeting with the fishing working group of that given First Nation area and work through details. So it might be that they're planning a fishery for 24 hours on the weekend, but you don't know what the hours are, or you might be targeting a set amount of fish, and so those kinds of details could be worked out later. And then they'll all need to create the legal instruments to authorize any fisheries.
Okay. Could I have the PPR number 5 brought up? If you could turn to page 100. Paragraph 271, we've set out some of the implementation of process for decisions made in the panel. And if I could just take you down to the second to last sentence that begins, for commercial fisheries, the area resource managers generate fishery notices as well as the variation orders. Is that accurate, or did we miss something?
I think it looks accurate. So these are created by local resource managers. The commercial and recreation ones are all approved through the salmon office, so Jeff's portion of this in headquarters, and then there's a sign off on some of these by the RDG, and looks correct.
Okay, are the area C&P staff involved in the variation orders?
No. They'll not in having to create them, but there's often a discussion with them about here. There's a notification to them for sure. There's some discussions about options sometimes in the creation of a fishery, but they don't have to help in drafting. So.
Okay.
But I believe, Barry, the area C&P staff do sign off on the completed variation order for the commercial fisheries.
Okay, thanks. And then paragraph 272, second sentence, the line reads, these fishery, so that we're talking here about fishing plans for First Nations, FSC, and economic opportunity fisheries. We say that the fishery plans are subsequently reviewed and must be approved by the Fraser River Integrated Management Team and by the Regional Director General. Is that correct?
Right, that's essentially myself and then through to the RDG. Yeah.
Okay, so are they approved by the Regional Director General?
Definitely there's a notice of all the fisheries, and there's not a formal sign-off on the like there is with a variation order or some of the other notices.
So it's not an approval as much as it's just an information to the RDG?
There's not a formal approval on these fisheries by the RDG. The communal licenses would be issued by the area offices.
Okay, thanks. Now, just to get into the integrated management team process, can you give me any more detail on how decisions are made for opening FSC fisheries? You just touched a little bit on it.
Well, there's a large number of meetings and places, and it's actually quite different between sort of three general geographic areas, so Marine, Lower Fraser, and the BC Interior. On the BC Interior side of it, most of the licenses that are issued it's one license and it covers the whole period of the fishery. There's very little change over time. And so there are weekly meetings, often for information, or if there's a need for a conservation concern or some other aspect to make a significant change. In the Lower Fraser and some of the areas up to even Lillooet, the management can be much more on a weekly basis. So there are fisheries harvest committees from the First Nations that meet with the DFO resource managers. And those groups are meeting at least once and often twice a week to try to go through as this information is changing and look for opportunities. So there's that give and take. From the FREMP side of things, the coordination that I'm providing into the process is you're often given some guidance for the group, but they need to go and look at the specific circumstances in the area to have the fishery, instead of saying, you have to open on Wednesday from 10 till 4, it might be a lot better for them to open on Wednesday from 4 till midnight, or that may be in their interest coming there. So the department doesn't, this is many of these fisheries are jointly managed, and the local groups need to decide what's in their best interest to try to have their fisheries and understanding their own circumstances.
Okay. Parameters set around the target amounts of fish?
Yeah, it's the amounts of fish and general time, so that we don't get conflict of gear fishing on top of each other, but the more details are created locally. Okay.
By your resource managers in collaboration with the relevant groups?
That's right.
Okay. And what about recreational openings? How is that process managed?
Well, each of the areas has, again, the South Coast, Lower Fraser, and Interior has either a recreational coordinator, manager, or a key person targeting to their recreational fisheries, but a number of them have larger involvement. So those fisheries we're looking at, again, less variation on a weekly basis. It's usually much more when do we think we can get started, in particular in the Lower Fraser or the marine approach areas, and when might we run up against either a conservation concern of another stock or species that we've had pre-season planned. So in cases like 09, where we never got a sockeye fishery going or any directed sockeye fisheries, that was updates weekly, but really one decision. We did take some actions when we thought we had unacceptable levels of encounter rates, so we'll have those kinds of actions, and we'll have meetings again with local groups that happens once a week, in this case on Tuesdays.
And ultimately, those decisions on openings are debated at the Canadian caucus level?
That's correct.
Okay. And for First Nations economic opportunity fisheries, what's the process for that? Is it again a discussion with resource managers and the affected First Nations?
Yeah, that one has a bit more discussion at caucus, but it's again mostly defined around the abundance. But in this case, the time is the one that gets more of the discussion at caucus, where if somebody wanted to have 4 days to fish and you thought you could get it done in 1 day, what might that mean to another commercial fishery or an FSC fishery? So more bounds are put on in that discussion in the caucus side of things.
Okay. And would the decisions for Musqueam and Tsawwassen First Nation also be part of that process within the economic
All
fisheries?
of the economic demonstration fisheries. There's a number of them throughout the Fraser.
Maybe just as meet with the First Nation planning committees for each of the economic opportunity fisheries as well, to discuss the parameters of the fishery and the number of fish they're targeting.
And then finally, commercial non-panel area openings, how are those? Are they just decided in the caucus, or do you have other preliminary meetings on those?
They're mostly decided in the caucus. There are, we have a weekly commercial conference call where all of the licensed area harvest committee reps can participate, so they get a sense of what's coming up. Area E is often one where there's a number of different scenarios provided to us, so we try to have a process where we can gather those in to the caucus meeting, but in the caucus is where those decisions are ultimately made.
And once decisions are made in the caucus on those areas outside of Fraser River Panel Authority, is there reporting to the panel of all those decisions and to the PSC for their information purposes?
Yeah, we report those in the panel meetings.
For 2009, were there any particular issues or challenges in managing the fishery that year?
Lots. Right from the beginning, we had a relatively low snowpack, and so we had anticipation of high levels of management adjustments. So we were anticipating from the beginning that we wouldn't be having just a normal level or an average level. Which did come to pass. We ended up with some of the highest, and in some cases record, temperatures, which does affect the management adjustment by stocks. We had a relatively large forecast for summer run stock grouping in sockeye, and relatively weak in the other three stock groupings. So thinking about how to optimize harvest to the strong stock and protect the three weaker stock groupings. There was considerable discussion around cultists and lates as a whole, and we had a plan for a total allowable mortality we settled on of 20%, but it wasn't 20% of the run no matter what. It was 20% of the run for the purposes of trying to harvest or optimize harvest towards abundant sockeye or pink populations. So that actually came into play later on in 2009 when there wasn't that strength in the sockeye, the summer run sockeye. So it didn't mean we could go fishing. And many of the reports actually, because of ease of reporting, look like there's attack at times when there's not, which is why Canada didn't access it, or didn't access all of it. We had other stocks of concern that we've identified. Some ship populations, coho, Saginaw sockeye, and Nipkish sockeye outside of the Fraser River, but which were thought of in our whole process. And so then, taking all that information, we were in the preseason planning with the U.S., as you mentioned earlier, your discussions maybe more with Mike Lapointe. The preseason management model that we use with the Fraser River panel, one of the objectives preseason is to come to a consensus fishing pattern from what the U.S. is hoping to accomplish in Canada is, and there's some rules that are defined in the treaty and in the Commission guidance that we use in trying to set those parameters. And in this case, Canada and the U.S. could not come to a consensus plan, so that's the first time that hasn't occurred. And so there was considerable uncertainty on when some of these fisheries might start, and particularly some of the low-impact fisheries that often do start before you have, reach the midpoint of the run and have a higher degree of certainty. And so whether it's the Canadian FSC fisheries or some of the U.S. They call them 4B, 5, 6C fisheries, but it's the Juan de Fuca area for the U.S. There was considerable uncertainty on those. So I probably didn't hit on all of them, but it was a pre-season. It was quite a difficult planning process, and then in season, right from the beginning, we had test fish results that were significantly less than expected for most populations, but not all. So we actually had Harrison in particular, which was extremely strong, but not on the stocks that were forecast. The 4 sub 1, which is the normal strength, was actually one of the biggest collapse stocks ever in the Fraser. But the 3 sub 1s were a phenomenal return at that stage, and subsequently returned as 4-year-olds in 2010. Adams, Cultus, and some of the other late run stocks returned relatively well and did well as far as spawning escapement objectives. We met or exceeded the spawning for late run stocks. And we had a phenomenal pink return forecast, and even a larger one that materialized. So the extreme temperatures in season, the MA, and then trying to figure out how we're going to fish, So our test fisheries performed very well. We knew in most cases that we were not experiencing large returns of fish, in fact substantially less than expected, so that was good. In season, we identified a problem in the IFMP that we hadn't expected, and that was in the early summers and summers. We didn't have a rule that if we came back at less than escapement objective, what we would do, and we do have that for, in this case, for the early Stewarts, and it's a long established and discussed process. And for the lates, we had a rule, but not for those other two stock groupings, and that created considerable problems in that these fish co-migrate, and a number of First Nations in particular were looking to fish for Chinook and trying to access some sockeye, and we needed to make up some understand if we were going to make a change in the FMP, in which case we did. We allowed some small fisheries to occur, either incidentally or directed on these early summer and summer stocks, and so there was considerable debate and challenges in trying to figure out how to share those, in particular amongst the First Nations, because we don't have a sharing rule, which is one of the things we've been striving for. But in that circumstance, we had a number of issues around that. There may be more. I liked it when you asked the shorter questions.
For the issue that you just described, where you didn't have the rule for early summers and summers that you had for, or a rule like you had for early Stewarts and lates. It may not be the same rule for early Stewarts and lates, but you had a rule to deal with the issue you described. Did you have to go back to the RDG to deal with that problem?
Yes, there was discussions with the RDG about options and what we should be trying to do.
And ultimately, did it have to go to Ottawa?
I believe that the RDG briefed Ottawa, but unlike the 2010 cultist change in plans that we talked about, we didn't, or I'm not aware that we briefed to the same extent and got that type of a sign-off.
Was there an actual change to the IFMP the same way there was in 2010, or was it just a management within the rules that you already had?
Well, the rules would have been nobody would have a fish, and we had harvests that were in the 3 to 5% exploitation range by first, 7% overall in total, 2% test, 3 to 5% probably by those stocks as an exploitation rate that was used in mostly incidental First Nations fisheries to Chinook, but some directed fisheries on sockeye. So that's a change from the plan.
All right, but it wasn't documented as a change to the plan?
That's correct.
Okay. Was there consultation with stakeholders about that change?
Within the panel there was, in the rec community, specifically on the Tuesday calls. I didn't participate when we were making that change in the commercial calls, but I would be very confident that did occur. And then there was extensive discussions with First Nations of what we could try to do around having some of these limited fisheries in different places.
Abundance of pinks in 2009. What was the impact of that on the sockeye management?
Well, there's a significant overlap, as we saw on Monday when you had the timing table up on the screen, and so with a return in this case end up estimated at 19.5 million. Half to 2/3 of that is overlapping with the sockeye. So trying to harvest those sockeye was trying to harvest the pinks and protecting the sockeye was a considerable challenge. One of the items that wasn't a challenge necessarily in the question I answered earlier, but which became a challenge in the pink fishery, is the late run sockeye had been migrating in early into the Fraser for the last 10-12 years, since 1996. And that creating problems that I'm sure you had some discussions around here, or will have before you're done, on route and pre-spawn mortality of those fish, changing their timing and migration behavior. In 2009, they reverted to more of a normal pattern, so they delayed in the Straits of Georgia, so that the Gulf off of the Fraser River, and so there was more mixing with the pink salmon than there had been in some of the previous recent cycles, but more of a traditional pattern. So the trying to harvest those fish and in this case get the pink harvest before coho conservation rules kick in were challenges. So Canada was able to harvest, or did harvest, something in the range of 2 million of about a 10 million total allowable catch available to them, and the U.S. harvested pretty much their full allocation in the range of 3.5 to 4 million.
When you mentioned just earlier that the Harrison stock came in strong as, I can't remember how you described it, but if I said to you the 3-year-olds were strong, but the 4-year-olds was weak, is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay. The weak 4-year-olds, would they be the same age class then as the other stocks that came back in such low numbers in 2009?
They're the same total age, but it's a unique population in the Fraser in that these are described as sub-1, so they don't spend a year in fresh water. It's a unique life history. Almost all of the sockeye of the Fraser, and most sockeye everywhere, spend at least 1 year in fresh water. In this case, these are populations that migrate in their first year out to the ocean, so they tend to spend 2, 3, 4 months in the Fraser River. So their total age is the same, but their life history is different.
Okay. And the 3-year-olds that came back strong, are they the same age class as the large numbers that came back in 2010?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you draw any conclusions from that?
There's many conclusions one could draw, but I mean, we take a look at the, in our forecasting in a lot of places, we take a look at interspecies productivity. So, are pinks doing well 1 year? Are the sub-1 stocks doing well? What are the coho doing? And so you hope that it's going to give you some kind of ideas, because some of those fish are spending portions of their life history together. But there's not any strong science papers that say that there's a specific correlation between a number of these different species or stocks. So it's a positive, but it's not necessarily going to play out into the record numbers we saw in 2010.
The wild salmon policy, just moving to a new topic. The wild salmon policy states that harvest management will focus on conservation of CUs. You know that?
That's correct.
Okay. How can management to CUs occur within the bilateral process?
Well, there's a number of factors there. So wild salmon policy says that we will focus towards CUs, but it also says we may manage to aggregates. And it actually expects that we will manage to a much more limited number of aggregates than all the CUs, because you can have 2 stocks that you classify as conservation units because they're in separate lakes, and you may not have strains, so you want to keep track of them. But if their timing, productivity, distribution is all the same, you're going to manage them potentially the same. But if they're, if something in there is different, then you're going to look and manage them potentially different. So there's creating aggregates is really a given in the way that all these populations have some degree of overlap. It's trying to understand what would be the best aggregation of the stocks. Within Canada, as I mentioned earlier, we take some of the populations. We might have some rules for Canada-US in the 4-time groupings, but Canada is under no obligations to stay there. And in recent years, we've managed to a finer suite of distinction. And so cultus is one. I mentioned this last year, and has been for a number of years, the earliest time miscellaneous part of the early summers. So there's different actions can be taken, and they have been taken. And around any of the populations, we've been starting to move more towards some of the terminal harvests. So even in 2009, some of the food, social, and ceremonial harvest that occurred was in the Harrison, discrete from the Fraser after they'd broken off, and was in the Thompson after the late run, in this case, Shuswap populations had segregated. So Canada has a fair amount of discretion there. And within the Canada-US process, the 4 aggregates, are probably the best way. Not necessarily it's 4, but some aggregation, and matching them to the timing through the marine distribution is the their distribution through the marine timing is the key way that we use to manage.
I'm going to read a part of the policy to you, and if you want me to pull it up on the screen, let me know and I'll do that. But at page 33 of the policy document, which is Exhibit 80, it says that the wild salmon policy will not preclude fisheries operating on population aggregates that include numerous CUs, but increased attention to all of the units within the aggregate will likely require significant changes to current management practices. Are you familiar with that language?
That's right.
What's being done in response to that? How is current management meeting this objective?
Well, we're in the process of doing a number of things, and some of them are done. So we've got the CU definition paper out. So we've defined what is a CU for all the different populations in BC for all the different species. And there still is some discussion around some of those. We had this around Fraser sockeye here just in November, where it was 1 year there was 5 sockeye in Tejon Cache area of the Fraser. So it shows as a CU, but really is it a CU? It's never been observed before or after. So we do have good documentation about whether it exists or not. But after that, we've got a status paper, so not a status, a benchmark paper that is currently in draft, but it was at our PSARC process that Jeff can correct me on what that's changed to in a second if you need it. So that's our science review process within Canada. And so trying to establish what would be the rules that we would use to set the benchmarks for each of these populations, so that helps to drive potential harvests and TAM rules, total allowable mortality rules. We have our Fraser River sockeye escapement paper, which was somewhat at the beginning of the wild salmon policy, and we've made a number of changes in that so that we can take a look at stocks on an individual stock basis within aggregates to the 19, not necessarily to all 35 of them. So how we want to bring that into play that Canada is working on. So there's a number of pieces that are in the process right now, that some of them are being utilized and some are not. The wild salmon policy, though, as a whole also talks about these aggregates, developing processes for consultation and bringing people together and trade-off of decisions and trying to meet the shared views of everyone. And so trying to get those processes in play is a big part of what we're trying to do, as well as to what are our common objectives that we're striving for.
Do you see the process as moving towards a set of rules then to govern the process, or something different?
Well, I think it's largely within the kinds of processes we've got, but we're going to need to adapt them in some ways. But whether it's specific rules or it's principles that are guiding you, I think is a part that we're going to need to see moving forward. I think we have a little bit of both right now, and I'm not certain that one way or the other meets all of the criteria. And I say that because we just spent the last year and a half, I was trying to lead the renegotiation of the Fraser chapter, and when you start trying to think of all the different variables that are out there and setting a rule for it, it was very hard for, in this case, within the Canadian caucus to come to consensus, or between Canada and the US. But we did fairly well and come together on what the principles should be that would drive us, or guide us, I should say, not drive us, in the decision making that we want to move forward on. And then you need to use all that best information. Everybody brings knowledge to that table.
Moving to another related but different topic, which is protection of weaker stocks. Is it fair to say that there's an assumption that if you manage to the dominant stocks needs, you will protect the weaker stocks at the same time, or we don't have specific data on the smaller stocks in a group?
Let me see if I got that right. If we manage to the large populations, we'll protect the small ones. That is an assumption we have?
Yeah, I mean, you can't.
I would say it's the opposite.
You can't do rules for the very, very small stocks. We don't have necessarily data for more than the 19 large stocks, for example.
Well, the 19 stocks are not necessarily large. Cultus is not large in recent times. It's the stocks that you can identify discreetly in some way, in many cases, or that you've been monitoring for a long period of time. So it's within the 19 populations, they don't all have the same data sets, the same periods of time. Scotch Creek, for example, had very few fish in it before the 1970s, and today it's got hundreds of thousands of them. So, they were probably always present, and they've colonized in a bigger way for a number of changes. That one, I can actually tell you why, but some of them I couldn't. In the case of the, so you have the 19 populations, and does that give you enough understanding across the 30-some, I think is a better question. Okay. But you cannot manage and set exploitation rates to the largest, most abundant populations and expect to protect the weakest ones, if that was a question. But on the weaker ones, we can set proxies for them. We need to study them in ways to understand, how does the proxy, how accurate is the proxy in trying to protect that particular population?
Maybe if I could add a bit to what Barry was saying, in the escapement memos that we produce each year, and some of these are in the exhibits, tab 11 in our binder here, the model overview and summary of 2009 planning simulations. When we're looking at harvest rules for Fraser sockeye and the shapes of those rules, we're also using the model to calculate the performance of the individual stocks in the model relative to spawning benchmarks that we've laid out, so we can look at the probability that those populations are going to be below a particular benchmark. We need to do more work to line those benchmarks up with the wild salmon policy work that Barry mentioned that in the paper that was presented this past fall, but we are trying to explicitly account for the populations and the harvest rules that we're laying out for these management units as well.
And if you manage the dominant, so just to flip it around, I got things a bit backwards when I was asking the question. If you manage the dominant stocks to protect the weaker stocks, the assumption is that it will protect all the stocks within that group.
With the right set of rules, it should.
Okay. And is that an assumption that has been used in managing the late runs to protect cultists?
That's correct. So that's where, even though you might have had, well, this last year we had a total allowable total allowable catch level exploitation rate for late runs that would have been in the 40-some%, but from cultists, we didn't. You could follow that and use that assumption, or you could use a different assumption. So in some years, it's better to use even the year before. The lates actually met their exploitation or met their escapement objective, but in the if you'd followed 20% or some other number, would you have gotten there? So I think you have to set the rules that think about that small population, taking into account. But so my point here is you're not going to necessarily be able to harvest all of the total abundant stocks, but they can still be a proxy that you understand what the implications are.
Has there been any science work done to support that assumption, that the managing the dominant stocks to protect the weaker stocks will protect all within the group?
You asked that question, it's kind of the same way you asked it before. Is there science that the large population is going to protect the small one? No. But
No. If you manage, is there science to support the theory, the assumption that if you manage the dominant group to protect the smaller group, like for example, if you manage late runs to protect cultists, that it will actually protect all of the stocks that are within the late run stock group?
Okay. We're not trying to manage the dominant stock, the aggregate dominant stock, to do that. In this case, we're trying to find a proxy, which is, so does it match in timing, productivity, distribution in different fisheries that's the most similar, and then trying to set the rules for what can cultists sustain and applying that to the dominant stock. But you're using the dominant stock to measure it because you can find it. So you're trying to set the rules around cultists, but if you were going to go find cultists to know whether you're measuring it properly and were successful, you wouldn't find them. So in the case of 2010, with 20-some million lates returning, 24 million, whatever is total, but 20 million to the Adams Weaver, which was the proxy, and expecting something in the 10, 15,000, 20,000 range, we'd be sampling to 5, 6, 10,000 fish at a time instead of the 100 to 300 we strive for. So does that make sense? You don't need to kill that many fish to know that you're making the right decision. So you use the proxy to make that calculation.
Right, moving to a new topic, in-river management model. Can you describe what that model is? And we do have available the Southern Endowment Fund proposal, if that's of some use in reviewing the issue. That's at tab 5 in your binder, CAN 003645. It's just a short concept document, but perhaps you can describe for us what that model is and what's being developed there.
I'm certainly not an expert on all the work that's been done on this particular model, but my understanding comes from presentations, a couple of annual presentations. I've sat in on the work that's been done here, primarily by researchers at SFU, and they're looking at whether they can develop a more explicit model to look at finer scale resolution on escapement objectives, perhaps at the CU level or at a finer scale resolution. They're looking at the consequences potentially of inaccurate or imprecise information on the CU run size, timing, and migration rates, and the ability to perhaps deliver harvest to some of the terminal areas, taking into account the best available information they've got. So they're also trying to factor in where the discrepancies between estimates of mission and upstream might take place, and so they've got a mortality component to the model. So this is really an effort to try and build a much more complex model of the Fraser watershed for looking at the migration of the fish and how we might achieve objectives if they were specified for more terminal areas. And this is quite a different approach than what's been done in the Fraser Spawning Initiative. The model we use there does not specify where the harvests occur or who or by who and how they might be allocated. So this potentially would be a tool that you might be able to look at that sort of thing over time.
Is the Department of Fisheries and Oceans involved in this project?
Yes, we meet regularly with the researchers to discuss the progress of their work, and they ask for feedback on incorporating various different components that they might want to be looking at in their research.
And has the department made any decisions about whether this is something that they would pursue when the work is done, or is it still too early?
I think this is still a work in progress, and as I said, so far we're just getting updates on how the work's progressed and what additional work needs to be done. So we haven't, to my knowledge, moved to a spot where we'd be contemplating policy changes at this point.
And where is this model or this project in the development of it? Is it completed? Is it being tested, or is it still being developed?
My understanding is it's still in the development stages. At least that's where the discussion was at the last time I attended a meeting on this, which was last year.
All right, thank you. I should mark this as an exhibit.
Exhibit number 337.
Moving to a new topic. When Mr. Lapointe was here, some questions were raised around overescapement, or that phenomena which has been described as overescapement. Just to summarize, it's been suggested by people, including Carl Walters, that escapement under current policies and perhaps going back as far as the 1987 rebuilding strategy allowed escapements to be too high on certain stocks, and that the high number of spawners has, for a variety of reasons, negative impact on productivity of certain of the larger runs. Are you familiar with that theory?
Yeah, well, Carl's been involved in 2 or 3 papers on this and media reports, which are not all consistent. So, but I have heard him state some of those claims.
There's also a suggestion that continued high numbers of spawners on certain stocks could result in a serious loss of productivity or a potential collapse of those stocks. Have you heard that argument as well?
I have. Yeah.
Do you agree that those are potential impacts from high levels of escapement on certain stocks?
Well, productivity has been shown to decline at very high levels or even higher levels of escapement. So I think a key is being aware that if you want to have the highest recruits per spawner, you probably want to have a relatively low level of number of spawners. That's those given fish will get the best places to spawn and have the best food to eat and whatnot. But there's a lot of inherent risk with that style of management, and that's not the management policy that's adopted by the department. As far as a collapse goes, there was a paper that Carl was one of the co-authors on that the department asked to be written that showed, after review of 20-some sockeye populations and a number of pink populations, that there is no catastrophic collapse or loss of stocks, at least within the Fraser, and it might have been larger area of review than just Fraser River populations. So I don't think we've seen that occur anywhere, and I don't agree that there'd necessarily be a loss of the total population or a catastrophic loss, but you definitely see a decreased productivity at the higher end, and that's most stock recruitment relationships show that as you get at the higher levels of spawn. And so again, there's other things that come into play of environmental and other factors that you're striving for, as opposed to just to fisheries production.
Maybe if I could just add a couple points to what Barry said. So the report Barry referred to was by the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council. I believe it was done in 2004 on the over-escapement issue. In terms of the decreasing production as the number of spawners increases, that is A key element of the models we're using in the Fraser sockeye spawning initiative, whether it's a Ricker variation of the model or a Larkin style variant of the model. We're using the best available data we've got to try and develop the model fits, but the models generally do contemplate decreased production as the number of spawners increases. It's not necessarily across all stocks though, so there may be some populations that can get to large spawner abundances, but other ones may not. So the management rules we're developing are contemplating the performance of all of the stocks in the model and are not necessarily just focused on one.
Mortalities began to be observed on the late run stocks in the 1990s. The department has implemented low harvest rates on the late runs to ensure that sufficient escapement occurred on the spawning grounds. Is that correct as a summary?
Yes, and the exploitation rates were decreased largely to account for that required management adjustment needed to ensure or attempt to ensure escapement objectives.
And the late runs also now tend to overlap more significantly with the summer runs than they did previously. Is that fair as well?
That varies between years and cycle lines.
But is it fair that they do tend to overlap more with summers since they stopped holding in the mouth of the Fraser?
Sorry, I didn't get the question there. In the marine side of things, we've seen very little change in the timing. So the timing between summers and lates in the marine area hasn't changed noticeably. Again, there's obviously variations between years or within years. The timing entering into the river has had more of an overlap with that, not having that delay to the same extent. And I mentioned earlier, but for 2009 and in 2010, the fish have reverted back to more of their traditional delay of 4 to 6 weeks in the Gulf before they entered. They're not up to 6 weeks yet, but I think we've been sitting in the 3-4 weeks each of the last 2 years. So that does vary between years.
Right. And is it the case that more fish are reverting to their old patterns, but not all? There's still a significant amount that are entering the river early?
There is fish that are still entering early. In the last year in particular, would not have been significant. It would be quite a small fraction.
Okay. Do you agree that the low harvest rates on late runs has resulted also in lower harvest rates on the summer runs, where those summer runs overlap with the late runs?
That's correct.
Okay. Has the resulting reduced harvest rate on the summer runs resulted in levels of spawners on the summer runs which are high enough to impact productivity?
We've been reduced recruits per spawner in some of those years.
Okay. Is that a concern for the department?
Well, I think it would be a concern overall, and it's part of what the discussion that, again, we bring to the tables on trying to establish escapement objectives in a given year and our harvest objectives. The escapements in the 2006, which were some of the largest in the last recent years, close to 5 million, produced the roughly 30 million in 2010. So I think that people seeing some of these larger escapements are also seeing the potential benefits that can occur. So I think there's much more to understand to know what escapement objectives that individuals would like to bring forward.
Maybe to add to Barry's point as well, like one of the key uncertainties when you're looking at the best harvest rule you should use for managing Fraser sockeye is what the impact of a larger escapement is going to be. We tend to have a lot of data that's at lower levels of spawners relative to out at the right-hand side, which is higher spawner levels. So there's considerable uncertainty about the response of the populations at some of these higher abundances of spawners compared to at low abundance.
This deals with the timing of the run and the timing of the harvest of the run. Is it fair to say that under the current management model, you wait until you know where the peak of the run is before you tend to permit high impact fisheries? Is that a fair?
The majority of the fishing is it's targeted around the peak of the run.
Okay. Is there a concern that we have a disproportionate harvest within the run itself, like we're not harvesting proportionately across all of the run because of that? It's either harvesting at the peak or at the tail of the run?
Well, there's a number of factors at play here again. So we have 4 stock groupings that were managed in most cases, and they have a number of different CUs or populations within them. So some are, they're not all affected equally by the harvesting to begin with, but you hope that the stock grouping represents the majority of them, or your focus. On the whether you're harvesting more on the later part of the run or the earlier part of the run in a given year, if you think that you've got a larger abundance early and the run subsequently doesn't materialize at the same magnitude, so in this case the second half of the run, so as to speak, then you could tend to be harvesting more in the beginning of the run. So in some of the recent years where the total returns are less than expected, sometimes you're finding that you're that scenario. And if the run continues to grow through time, which we saw in 2010 and was later, the harvesting was probably quite proportionate to the runs, but could be more on the later side. So you can over time, I would suggest it probably balances out, because we're often seeing differences in either the run being smaller or larger than even when you think you're around the peak. But the majority of the time, I think you're probably there, because the peak tends not to range once you think you've got it by more than 3 or 4 days. So each of these fisheries, assuming that they're harvesting what you're striving for, is probably driving it more, and it's balanced.
I'm just going to move to the post-season process. Most of what we talked about now has been sort of in-season work. When do you consider the beginning of the post-season phase of the year?
Well, after the fisheries are completed, and at times, though, we will still have, we could have no fisheries or very limited fisheries, and still have assessment going on, so we're still trying to understand the run. So 2009 would be an example where the fisheries wouldn't necessarily define when you ended, because we really didn't have any. But once we've done our assessment and our fishing side of things, generally the in-season is over.
And when does regulatory control transfer from the panel back to the domestic processes?
About those same times. If we don't anticipate any further fishing, and in the case of the U.S., it comes off in a staged approach as the stocks migrate through their areas as well, so from the outside to the inside, and Canada's tends to go off as one set process, but it's similar kind of timing.
Are there any commercial fisheries that occur after the transfer of regulatory control?
Not for Fraser sockeye or pinks in the panel waters, but other species there are. That's why we transfer the control, so you can harvest planned fisheries and have fisheries for chums primarily.
Okay. And spawning escapement, that's thought of as a post-season activity, but it occurs in season and post-season. Is that right? The enumeration of
the in-season and post-season is usually more thought of on the harvesting side of it. So the stock assessment, in this case, the spawning grounds assessment, is something that's is occurring as those fish are arriving and on the spawning grounds. So in the case of the early Stewart first stock in, they're primarily being enumerated in August, late July and August, and obviously we're still in fishing mode for other populations at that time. So there's an overlap.
Once you're in the post-season phase, what does the Department of Fisheries and Oceans have to do with respect to sockeye management on the Fraser?
Well, we prepare 3 reports. One is the record of management strategies you were talking about earlier. There's a post-season report for the Pacific Salmon Treaty that encompasses all fisheries within the treaty, but the Fraser sockeye and pink are a component of that. And then we produce what's called a Southern BC Fisheries Report. It's not the right title.
It's a post-season report for Southern BC.
Post-season report for Southern BC, thanks. So the information in each of those is, well, the RMS is significantly different, but the other 2, one is focused on international fisheries and not necessarily all of our domestic issues and points that we want to cover, and the Southern BC one, which is a Canadian paper, has all of the information. So that's a key. We also have to collect up all of the biological information. We're confirming catch information from fisheries going through. So managers are trying to get the final information as opposed to preliminary or some of the in-season documents. And then there's reviews of how effective were fisheries decisions, how effective were the test fishing programs and whatnot. Mike might have went through that in some more detail, but the tech committee is having reviews of some of this stuff, as is the panel, and those are presented normally in our January what's referred to as our postseason report at the panel, where we start to get that information presented back at the panel level and concluded in February. And then we hold postseason meetings domestically to go through similar kinds of reviews.
The postseason meetings that you hold, who are those with?
It's a broad range. That's probably the part I missed to begin with. So but the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee that we just held in the last 2 days ago as a postseason review. So that's the aggregate of First Nations, commercial, recreational, Marine Conservation Caucus together. There's First Nations meetings in an aggregate sense being planned for next week. The sports fish is early February, and the commercial fishing one was planned for this week. So they're across all the range of people that we deal with, all of the different groups of interest, domestically as well as the Canada US process.
All right, there's a November meeting of the IHPC. Is that dealing with postseason matters?
It is, but you're still in a very preliminary stage. So we often, at that one, we're more talking about people's interests and issues around the fishery or around things that they, how well did something work? We might have tried. We had over the last 2 years, we've had a couple of innovative fisheries around the area, Be Sane group, and so, that or some other aspects. So we're trying to get issues that the various groups have raised amongst themselves in their own thought processes. And then it gives us a chance within the department to collect data and do any analysis that groups might be looking for, or that we might want to bring to the meetings that just are occurring usually in January, along with the more formalized catch reports and escapement information, things like that.
One of the things that you said is done is an assessment of how effective your management strategies were against your goals. And I take it one of those objectives is to meet your escapement targets?
That's correct.
Do you use the pre-season targets to determine your effectiveness, or do you do an adjustment once you know to those pre-season targets once you know what the final run size numbers are?
Well, you're usually adjusting to what did you know when you're making your last in-season decisions, so that you don't once you know the final numbers, that is the final number of the spawning grounds. But so the target that you had, which in 09 and 2010 varied considerably from pre-season, in-season, as the run sizes changed 1 year down and 1 year up. So it's against that objective that we're looking to see post-season how effectively we were. Okay,
if I could have the PPR number 5 brought up. I think we need a correction in this document on paragraph 278, which is page 102. So that paragraph 278, can you just tell us if there's a correction that needs to be made there?
Yeah, it would be comparing the actual escapements to the last in-season target, escapement target.
Okay.
So it's not the pre-season target.
Mr. Commissioner, I said yesterday that we'd take a break at 11:15 and 12:15. I see it's 11:15 now. I won't be very much longer after the break, but we should probably take our break now.
We will now recess for 15 minutes.